Hey, this is Derek Murphy of Creativity. A few years ago, when I started working with editors or authors full time, I put up a post on my main blog, which was how to self-edit your book, 25 writing tips for indie authors. That's something that we made also for book butchers when we started editing a lot of books. And these are just kind of simple self-editing tips and tactics to improve your manuscript before you publish, to get rid of common writing flaws. But for the last year, I've been working on a new book, which is called Bookcraft. And while I was doing that, I was keeping a running list of other things that I noticed in other people's books. I work with a lot of authors. I'm asked to review a lot of manuscripts, and none of this is bad. These are all well-written manuscripts. There's nothing wrong with the writing. You can be a very good writer and still make common amateur mistakes if you don't know what you're doing. So what this post is about specifically things that happen in the first couple of pages. This is going to be true for your entire book, but agents and readers won't go beyond the first few pages if they notice writing mistakes. And these are either going to be signs of weak writing, or they're simply not going to engage the imagination or interest in a way that they could if things were done better. And again, this is not about the writing quality. This is all about the content and the structure and the organization and stuff. So these are just things that I noticed that are flags that I would point out if I was helping you critique your manuscript, or the first chapter critique, which is one of the things that I sometimes do for clients. I'm going to see if I can go through them kind of quickly in one video. Hopefully it won't be an hour long, but possibly could be. I'll try to go quickly and not comment on every single thing. This is basically, by the way, the short version of the book. I've already gotten some negative reviews for Bookcraft, which is, I got 1,300 pre-orders. It was #1 in all of its categories. So it's a successful launch, except that it's a difficult book to read. So the reviews that came in early were from people who didn't endure the process. And partly that's my fault because I made it too inaccessible. I didn't have the beginning structure mapped out the way that I could have intentionally, because I really wanted people to get into the content. But the downside of that was that people who felt overwhelmed just gave up and were quick to leave negative reviews. And the people who are still reading it, the positive reviews haven't come in yet. But if you found my writing overwhelming, which is absolutely okay, I tend to be long-winded. I definitely added a lot more content to make the book more interesting rather than more easy to use. That was a decision I made in the developmental process. I'm still waiting to hear whether or not that was a smart decision. Hopefully a lot of people who are reading the book did get value out of it and did like the style of the writing. But if that isn't the case and people just want the quick and dirty tips, this is actually a 25 signs of amateur writing section that I put into the bonus content at the back of the book, but I'm also putting it up here on the website, writethemagic.com, along with this video, so that I have many different ways for authors to learn the most important stuff from my content, even if they don't like this new book or the way that I wrote this new book. So hopefully this video is useful, or if I talk too much in the video, you can just skim down and read the content itself. So I'm just going to scroll down here a little bit and try to summarize. I've written this out too, so I won't just say what I've written. I'll kind of just go off the headings. First one, #1, is purple prose or big words. There's an argument about literary versus commercial writing that I tried to make a case for in the book that actually isn't that important, because the difference isn't really that big a deal. Literary writing tends to be more ornate and flowery, but it has a certain place. Not every book written in that style is a better book, because that style doesn't belong in a lot of genres. It can actually be a sign of weak writing with new writers. And I will quickly comment. Someone gave me the feedback earlier where I said, learn to be a better writer or whatever. And they were kind of offended because I was assuming that they weren't a good writer already. So when I talk about weak writing or amateur writing. Amateur just means you do it for the love. MA comes from the Latin love. So amateur is to do something for the love. That's your driving purpose. You're not concerned with the craft or the market or anything else. If it doesn't feel good in the moment, then you don't want to be writing, which is a common state for most beginner writers. Eventually, you may come to the point where you want to learn how to do things on purpose to avoid a lot of the frustration. And that's kind of what I teach, is how to plan and write a book for an audience without wondering, is this any good? Is anybody going to like it? And this isn't even a huge deal because, like I say in the book, you're going to write the way that you write. You're going to have your own style, and that's fine. I love fancy words. My book has way too many fancy words. I've learned that might hurt me because rather than just presenting all the information in the clearest manner possible, I had a lot of fun with the style of the writing, and I probably did overwrite quite a lot of it. I still love those passages, but if they slow it down for all the readers who don't appreciate that style, I'm doing a disservice to my audience. So there's a place for writing big fancy words, and there's a whole section in the book about description and word choice and editing and all that stuff. It's a red flag because if the words are not the most important thing for the majority of commercial genres, even most literary fiction, the words are not the most important thing. So if the words are the most important thing in your story and they're getting in the way of the content, that's a red flag. That's a problem, especially in the first few pages. That's not to say you can't have beautiful flowery description, which you certainly can, and you can have beautiful writing. It's important to establish your writing style in the first few pages, but you have to focus on what's actually happening and describing the scenes and showing the action. If your words are getting in the way, and also it's about, you're always trying to paint a picture in readers' minds. So if you're using words that don't have a visual component and you're asking them to go into their rational editing brain for the words and the meanings instead of creating pictures in your mind, that's where the big danger comes from. The next one is incidental notes to readers to fill in backstory. I have a whole bunch of stuff about this in the book, but basically authors feel like they have to explain things to readers while things are happening. So for every sentence where there's action, there's another sentence of backstory or explaining or info dump. And in the worst cases, this can be like one sentence of action and then 2 or 3 paragraphs of a backstory, on and on and on for the first few chapters where nothing has really happened. It's all just catching readers up with backstory. There's a way to do backstory well. You want to have good backstory for your characters, but you don't want it in the first few pages. You want to really focus on getting the action started. So I have some examples here about all that stuff. Number 3 is too much description. And I have examples of description. I love doing description and focusing on the visual scene. But you want the description to be at the surface of the story, which means you want to break it up so it's not just one big paragraph, and you don't want it to just be sitting there where you are telling readers what things look like. You want your characters to be interacting in a believable way with their environment. So you also want to focus on spotlighting the things that matter to establish the scene without describing everything, because the more you describe things, and this is the other key point, it's like you're zooming in with your camera and you're giving it screen time and importance. You're saying this thing is important. So for the most crucial scenes or people or objects or whatever, those are the things that you want to go into greater detail about when your character is noticing those things in the context of the story. And otherwise, if everything is beautifully described, readers are quickly going to start skipping over the descriptions, or they're not going to recognize what's important or what's not important. Your beautiful passages later on, when they're important, are not going to be as impactful because you've been doing it the whole time. Number 4 is a confusing timeline. So if you're doing a lot of backstory, flashbacks. If we can't figure out when is the now, when is this story taking place, or like if your preface and first chapter is trying to catch readers up, you're doing all the backstory first. So it's the whole protagonist's life getting up to the first moment of the actual beginning of the story. That's going to be a problem. And you probably want those backstory reveals to happen later when we care about the characters. And the way to get people to care about the characters is to make them sympathetic and put them in danger. Aristotle says pity and fear. You have to get people afraid of what's going to happen to the characters. That's kind of the whole thing. If they don't care about your characters, they don't know who they are enough to care about them. They don't care what happened to them 15 years ago. So you want your backstory to reveals which are important to justify the character's motivation at this point where they are forced to make a difficult decision. That's why backstory reveals are important. So just before the crucial pivotal decision that forces them to change or to, sacrifice, that's when you can go back into their history to do a full backstory reveal and make that decision more important, to show why the decision is so hard for them personally, to show why this thing that they're going to do has so much emotional impact for them. You can do a full backstory reveal then, and we'll actually care about it, and we'll know why this matters, why this story matters so much to the characters. So the problem with number 4 is if in the first couple of chapters, and this goes into point 5, you can't see my fingers, but point 5 is the first chapter feels like an earthquake. They don't know who the characters are or when the now is or what's happening now or why it matters, and things are changing so quickly. We're not given the opportunity to understand what's at stake, who the character is, care about them, and show a hint of danger. If we are not invested in the first plot line, it's going to be hard to take us to other ones and start all over again without at least getting us to a certain point where we are invested in what's happening. Number 6 is multiple adjectives. You need to choose the best word that you can. A lot of people will use adjectives for description. So to describe something, they'll just use 3 or 4 or 5 adjectives. That's a mistake. It draws attention. It's rarely done well. You want to mix the adjectives with actual physical scene description. So the problem with adjectives is they're useful shorthand, but it's not real description. It's a reference to a little piece of information that readers can access. So when you say green, you're not showing them something green. You're telling them that the word, is green. They reach into their own consciousness for the definitions of the adjectives that you present. It doesn't mean you're really doing vivid screen description. They're still fine, but if you have many of them in a sentence and it's just a whole bunch, or if you have 2 or 3 sentences with 2 or 3 adjectives each, that becomes a problem. It just means you're not being specific enough with your language. Number 7 is navel-gazing characters, which just means your characters are in their head. So if your characters are starting out in the first few pages, going through their life events, thinking back about all the things that ever happened to them, people don't do that naturally. People normally have things that they should be doing unless they're in a specific environment where, there's nothing else they can possibly do. They're out in the country or on vacation or something, and usually something bad has happened that triggers the fear and the worry that makes them revisit those traumatic childhood events. They're probably not just going to be reflecting about their life for the first few chapters. They can later on, much later on, when they're wrestling with big decisions, but that's not a good way to introduce characters to readers. So you want to be careful about any time that your characters are just thinking to themselves, kind of talking things through. Number 8 is needlessly clever metaphors. The problem with metaphors that I've seen in some amateur writing samples is just a whole bunch of metaphors. And the funny thing about metaphors is they can feel super clever when you come up with them. You're creating this cool, creative way to link these things and describe something in a new, fresh way. But when you give a metaphor, you're putting a picture into readers' minds directly. You want to make sure the metaphors you choose establish the mood of the scene that it's in. But if you have a lot of metaphors, what you're doing is throwing visual confetti at readers' imaginations, and they're imagining all of these random things. So you have to think like, on this page, what are all the pictures that I used? And if I put those all together in a collage, would it make sense? If giving my readers a collage bouquet of disparate images is what you're going for, it's probably going to be overwhelming. You can use them maybe, one per page or less, even one or two good ones per chapter. In nonfiction, especially, you want to be careful not to throw in too much, but also in fiction, you want to be describing the actual scene. You want people to be picturing what's really happening in the actual environment, not necessarily a bunch of random things that are not happening in the environment. I have a section in Bookcraft that's about how to lie to readers, and you can use visual metaphors on purpose to create scenes that aren't actually there in the world building, but they can be there in the characters' imaginations. That's kind of a cool thing that you can do. You just want to be careful about using too many and creating a weird collage of things. Number 9 is too many people. When you're introducing a lot of people in the beginning, in the first couple chapters, it'll be tempting to give each of them a description and each of them a backstory and explain how these people know about each other. And that can be really overwhelming if you do it for every character every time you introduce them. When you already have a plot or a story going on, which hopefully you do, the description is going to interrupt or interfere with the flow of the action. That's what you want to be careful about. So you can usually show description when the protagonist is interested in that character. So in the very beginning, they will probably barely notice that character, or they will just notice a few, like, he was tall, he had dark hair, like just enough. Later, when she's getting to know him and she's looking closer and they have time to get to know each other and have, face to face, that's when you can start sharing more details, because again, you want readers to know what's important by the details that you share. So as characters or objects become more important and your protagonist has a reason, a plot-based reason to be looking closer, that's when you can give more description, except that you also don't want chapters to go by with no character description, so that, later on when you deepen the description, you don't want readers to be imagining one thing and then be surprised when it's actually a different thing later. So you do need to sneak in enough of the right description to keep them basically on base. You just want to be careful about breaking up your story or your action, especially in the first couple chapters or pages when it is really so crucial. Number 10 is needless detail. So if you've done a lot of research, I see this most often in like thriller, adventure, action books, and there's a place for it. Depending on your audience, they may like the specific details which add authenticity, but they can interrupt the flow of the story, especially if they come too early. You'll notice a pattern talking about the first couple of pages. This is all stuff that will distract from the action of the story. Readers can't care about your characters until they know them and feel sympathy for them and are afraid what's going to happen to them. So you have to establish the character is likable and bad things are going to happen really quickly before you distract your readers enough to care about your story. That's kind of the main thing. So you do, it's nice to do research for your book, and you do want to be specific with details, but you don't want to overdo it to the point where, it's all words that readers don't know. You're also limiting, you're raising the bar for accessibility. So if you have a whole bunch of specific language that half your readers aren't going to get, that doesn't really improve the story, it's a risk to use it if you're going to be alienating readers who aren't familiar with all the jargon. Likewise, point 11, which is kind of similar, is swearing. And swearing is fine, but you want to use it intentionally. It's fine when characters do it. It's less okay when the narrator does it. It's rarely okay to throw in a whole bunch in the first couple of pages. And by a whole bunch, I mean like 10 or 20 curse words per page, as opposed to 1 or 2 in an action-based scene where it's relevant to establish a character. Even so, I'm fine with swearing. Some people are not. In some genres, some readers may have liked your story without the cursing. In other genres, readers are so desensitized to it, or they expect it. I have found that some of my books with swearing performs better because it has more edge. It has more adult content, I guess. I mean, I write young adult, and I don't swear very often, but most of my books have a couple of swear words in them. And I've also found that, like, on the one hand, it makes some readers happier. It's probably like if there's only 3 or 4 curse words in the entire book, it's probably not worth it to alienate the handful of readers that are opposed to it. You just have to know your numbers. You have to know your audience. If you're getting reviews like this book would have been great without the curse words, you have to assess whether those are your main readers or your accidental readers, and which audience you want to focus on improving, and whether you can strengthen the book by removing or adding curse words. It's not necessarily like a personal preference as much as a marketing decision. 12 is backstory, and I kind of commented on a lot of this before, except this part, which is good. Here's a good rule of thumb: make them ask a question before you give them an answer. So the problem with backstory is nobody cares about your readers yet. They don't know why it's important. And if it's important, it's way too early to share in the first couple of paragraphs, chapters, or pages. What you want to do is create enough suspense and intrigue, which is hard to do, but I have a lot of useful stuff about it in the book. You want to create suspense and intrigue so that readers care about what's happening, and you want them to be asking the questions. You want to show that maybe something happened, or you basically want to show the weird behavior first, which is just weirdness that creates conflict or drama. Later on, when it becomes important, when you want your readers to fall in love with your characters, which is near the midpoint of your book, before you get into the really big conflict stuff, that's when you start to reveal some more of the critical backstory, which helps to justify mostly their obstinacy, especially for the protagonist. A good book is an impossible quest, which means that for the book to matter, the character is forced to change. The protagonist is forced to change because the problem was impossible for them to overcome without having to grow. So you can't make that change happen very quickly. You have to give reasons that the protagonist doesn't quit the quest. The quest has to be so difficult it's going to destroy them, and the protagonist doesn't run away. They commit to it. So you have to have a really strong backstory that establishes why the main character is so obstinate and stubborn that they can't not fulfill their quest. It's necessary for them, like a fatalistic desire for whatever they want is worth being destroyed for, basically. And so the backstory is really critical, but it can't all just come out in the beginning. You want to make them sympathetic, but you don't do that by their huge, big story reveals. You do that by showing them the person that they are. You show that they're a good person and that their life is difficult and that they're trying their best, not, their whole history, because we don't care about that yet. You just show who they are, not how they got that way. 13 is all the big action. And so you can have a lot of action if you have a short preface, or in chapter 1. This is also pretty common to do in thrillers or something, where you set up a violent scene or a murder scene in a crime mystery investigation. You show the danger first, but generally with a preface. I don't know if I've mentioned this specifically because this is all about first chapter mistakes. There is content in the book about how to do a preface, but basically in a preface, it's not a full chapter, so you're not giving away details. You're just showing the hint of conflict or danger. You're not giving characters names or revealing the antagonist or sharing backstory or any of that stuff. You're just kind of sharing a riveting scene. And there's a place for that. but it's not a full chapter, because if it's a full chapter, we don't know these characters. We don't know why any of this stuff matters. You can show the protagonist actively involved in a high stakes scene. For example, like at the beginning of a detective movie or something, you might start with a flashback scene where they lose, whatever destroyed them to put them in their hole, because detective thriller stories usually start with a retired reclusive expert who is needed for some big case, and they pull him out of hiding, but he doesn't want to be there. He has reluctance or resistance, which is crucial because of something that happened earlier. We may not get that big backstory. It can work really well in a movie. In a book, I think it works better to save that until later. But another way to do it is just have like the wrap up of a success. You show them being successful in their environment. You show them being awesome in whatever they're good at. You just show them being awesome, basically. So if this could be a lawyer, this could be a teacher, this whatever their thing is, you could just show them kicking ass if there's a lot of action. But you also want to make them sympathetic pretty quickly. So you might start with like the end of a thing where they successfully complete a side quest or the mission or whatever. And then afterwards you start with the sympathizing personal stuff a little bit. It can work. The danger is just if you start off with a big scene, all these characters and all this violence, there's not really conflict, because conflict is not just the big stuff that happens in the scene. It's the underpinning, why does it matter, emotional angst that your characters are feeling. And we don't care about these characters yet. So, violence is going to work a lot better later on. You also don't want to too much violence in the very beginning means your final violent fight scenes are not going to feel as compelling because we've already, blown a bunch of stuff up too early. This is really more about explaining the difference between backstory and real story, but a real story is unresolved conflict. If it's already resolved conflict, then it's not as strong or powerful. It can communicate the emotional needs of the character and why they're doing what they're doing later on when the stakes are real. But especially in the beginning, backstory feels like concluded action. There's no real suspense or intrigue. There's nothing to find out. So it's weaker content for the beginning. It can be important for character motivations later, but in the beginning, you want to focus on the real story of what's actually happening. Real story is whenever you're setting your time, your now of your book, even if you're writing in past perfect or past participle, there's going to be a moment where the protagonist doesn't know what's going to happen next and has to make hard decisions. So the real story are the things that develop in that moment for the character that are unresolved conflict. There's a lot more about it in the book, but it's important because it's the biggest thing. Chapter 4 is all about that because it's the biggest thing that authors get wrong, that nobody else really teaches, that I hope I've presented a lot of strategies to help you to avoid. Similarly, all the answers I mentioned earlier, you want readers to be asking the questions before you give the reveals. There's also a lot about how to do twists and reveals. But basically, you don't want to start the book explaining too much and giving away all of the answers. Readers don't care about it yet. And if you give them all the answers and explain everything, there's no suspense or intrigue. They're not going to keep reading the book. They already know why this is happening. They're not going to keep reading to find anything out. You also want to avoid all the painful trauma, emotion, and heartbreak. If your first chapter is too emotional, just like the violence thing, it's not going to be satisfying later when it actually matters. And readers don't care about your characters yet. If they don't know these people, if they're just sitting there being emotional, they don't care because they don't know why any of this matters, because nothing's happening yet. So you want to be careful about, it's basically a backstory almost always, but it's very similar to the navel gazing. But you don't just want to try to make the sympathetic by showing what the character has gone through, or their traumatic childhood, or all the things that have led up to this point, because this point doesn't matter because nothing's happening yet at this point. It's important. The whole book is about how to make your book more emotional, but you ruin it by putting it all too early in the first couple chapters. This is an easy one, but don't use exclamation points or question exclamation marks. This is a way that authors try to give more emotional impact to their words without actually writing it in the scene, by just having the characters be excited by using a lot of exclamation points rather than showing an exciting scene or showing the characters respond to the excitement in a believable way. It's almost always a sign of weak writing. It's a really easy thing to edit or watch for, so just kind of keep that in mind. It's a common amateur writing or sign of weak writing mistake. This one's actually funny. I should have put in here, also don't use all caps. And then in the next section, I use all caps, which I tend to do in blog posts, but I would try not to do in a real book. I almost would never do it in a novel. And the reason is because it looks like yelling and it's cheating. It's kind of the same as this double exclamation mark. Rather than showing a believable description of a character shouting in a scene, you're just using punctuation to communicate action, and that's kind of cheating. There's a place for it, like, text messages maybe, or alarms or emergency alerts or something, but most of the time, if you have a lot of all caps in your book, that could be a problem. I would probably try to get rid of most of them. This doesn't actually belong in this section. This is about when something happens, stop writing. That's number 18. That's also kind of an easy one, but when you present your new information, every scene is building to a change, and the change can be a discovery of new information that impacts the character's decisions. But whenever that thing is, whenever you have your reveal or your new information, it's got to hit. It's got to be recognized that this is a moment. This is something happening. And when you get to that thing, when you get to the point of the scene where something happens, that's when you want to break the scene. So that's when you have a scene break or a chapter break. That's what makes your moments and your impactful twists and happenings matter, and you mark that they are important, and you keep the kind of page turning narrative, the momentum of your book, by making sure you stop right after that critical reveal or twist or event or happening, rather than what most people do is, something will happen and the character will respond immediately and the scene will keep going. Whenever something new happens, you want to break, and then the action needs to continue in the next scene. So it's a pretty easy thing to fix. This is probably something that happens late in the revision or the editing stages, when you've got your scenes, but now you're working on, how am I going to break these up into my effective manuscript? This one's actually almost the opposite of the one I mentioned earlier about too much description, but you also don't want to not describe a scene for too long. You want to find a way to do it within, as dialogue tags around character movement, or within how the protagonist is interacting with the environment, rather than a description dump, especially in the first couple paragraphs. But you do want to work in enough description so that readers can see what's happening while you're introducing new characters. You want to try to avoid, the main character stood in front of the mirror and reflected and commented about she'd never really liked her big brown eyes or her long tangled red hair or whatever. Try to be careful about that, because it's overdone, it's a trope, it's too easy. But you do want to find a way to describe your character's description early enough so that they're not thinking about or picturing the wrong things for too long. Another easy one is to have the thing happen first. So at the beginning of, whenever you have the scene break after the thing happened, you'll start with a new chapter. You'll skip to the response, or if there's a transition, they've just figured out, oh, well, I guess we're going to have to go and steal the key or whatever. The next scene would probably start with not a discussion of how they're going to do it, but they've gotten to the thing, and now they're breaking in. You would start with an active scene where they're fumbling with the keys at the front door, trying to break in, and they're, snarky humor at each other, whatever. You start with the scene happening, and then you can quickly throw in some description or, the backstory of how they got here, or, they left the car outside, just a couple of sentences to kind of figure out the connectors. But first, you start with something happening, or you can start with conversation first. You start with a sentence or two about a conversation, and then you throw in some movement, backstory, description, and then you continue with the conversation. You don't want to just start with transition or describing scenes or paragraphs where nothing is happening, but the author is just talking directly to the readers. There's a lot of stuff in the book about how to tell if it's backstory, or how to tell the difference between showing and telling, and how to do it right. But you want to try to start with a thing happened, and then maybe some backstory or description before you get back to the thing, because you've got their attention. You want to be careful about nothing is happening, where you just have pages of description or backstory that's concluded, resolved conflict. It's not unresolved conflict. There's no suspense or tension. You want to try to focus in this main story. Just a minute, my phone is going off. So I'm back, and I was talking about nothing is happening. Basically, you want to be aware of any places in your book where your characters are just standing still. Maybe it's you're doing narration or description, or the characters thinking about stuff. You want to give them something to do. If they're thinking about stuff, they have to be doing something that doesn't occupy their mind. So maybe they're, in a car going somewhere, or you have them engaged in an activity like washing dishes, just so there's something happening that's not just you talking while the characters stand there. 22 is POV, or point of view jumping. This, of course, can happen in third person omniscient, where you're in the heads of a lot of different people at the same time, and you're jumping back and forth. It can be difficult to switch between, and I'm not sure if I have this in here about thinking. I think maybe later, but there's a place about how to describe, or how to punctuate even the thoughts of a person. And if they're thinking in first person and you then skip to third person, it's going back and forth, that can get really confusing. It can also be confusing when you're jumping between a lot of different characters or getting in their heads, and it's hard to figure out, who's telling the story, or what can all the thoughts be read. It's hard to keep track of, how far the narrator can see and how they have that knowledge. It can be done, of course. There are genres where you're going to need to kind of jump around. And mostly what I'm talking about is dual point of view characters, because people ask about that a lot. And my answer is usually, yeah, it can be done, but it's really hard. So you might have more success at trying to write a more stable one main character point of view, at least for your first book, rather than trying something harder, which is jump back and forth between characters. It depends on your genre. Jumping back and forth between dual POV, it's not that common, it's not that popular anyway, so it may seem like a fun way to tell your story. It can be really difficult. I really struggled with my first novel, trying to figure out how I can tell this whole story with only the knowledge of the first protagonist. And so in my early scene, I had one or two scenes from the love interest who is a mermaid. But those scenes didn't, I liked them. I really didn't want to cut them, but they just didn't work in the book. And it wasn't worth it to try to put in those few scenes of POV jumping, rather than figuring out how to tell it from the point of view of the protagonist. I think I basically covered this one earlier, but descriptions for each character. So while you're introducing all of your characters at the same time, and you're trying to fit in their character descriptions, it can be really hard to do and interfere with the story. So you want to tell as much as you need to when you're focused on that character. but it's hard to do a lot of description about everybody at the same time, at least a lot of backstory about everybody at the same time. So a few little points of description so they have some idea, but if you can, break up some of the description over a larger portion of the book between sections of action. 24 is a little bit harder. We won't feel sympathy if we don't have the details in the vague posting. You do want to establish that bad things have happened to the characters for intrigue, but you can't just say, I don't really have a good example. You can't just say, this terrible thing happened, but then not give any details about what it was. I'm not sure if I can even describe this because this would be a whole video. You want to make them sympathetic to your main characters by stuff that they're doing in real time in your first couple of chapters, and not the deep stuff, because you just want to make them likable first. They won't feel real sympathy or emotional pain for characters that they don't like. So in the beginning, you just have to get them to be likable by showing them doing good things, showing their actual character in action, rather than hinting at bad stuff that happened. I think I've seen examples of this where it's not a good idea to just dump a whole bunch of emotional backstory at the beginning, but it's also not a good idea to even mention that traumatic backstory without bringing it up or resolving it or anything, because we don't know what it means. We don't care yet. That's not the story yet. That's not the story until we care about the characters and until the stakes are real and things are happening and the character's in danger. And by danger, I don't just mean an action or a thriller. A story that matters, a story, an impossible quest, is one that threatens the main character's sense of self. So everything is going to feel dangerous when it's threatening who they are, what they want, their status quo, their relationships, their lives, anything that threatens what their desires or their goals, that's going to be the danger. So focus on showing the character as likable, showing them with desires or goals in a difficult or uncomfortable situation. Those are the stakes, whether or not there's actual violence or not. Once that's all set up, before you get to the really big, stressful scenes that are forcing the change, that's when you go deeper with the sympathy and the backstory and the emotional reveals. Bad dialogue is also more difficult to talk about without specific examples, but mainly it's things that don't sound natural. So when you have long sentences with no apostrophes, where they're saying out every single word, it can seem stilted. If they're repeating information that they already know, or if they're repeating each other's names, which I don't think happens in real life very much, or commenting on things that both characters know that they wouldn't talk about out loud. The other main thing is you always want to be interrupting dialogue. You don't want dialogue without conflict, and you don't want to give away information easily. Whenever there's important information, it has to be resisted and fought for. The more important it is, the more difficult it has to be to obtain. So you never want them just sitting around talking to each other. You always want their real feelings to be interrupted just before they say the thing that they need to say for the story to continue. You always want to be creating more drama and conflict by resisting resolution until you get to the end of the book. So bad dialogue is just, cheesy things, melodramatic things. This also fits with the way that you describe how characters are saying things. If you have a lot of adverbs or adjectives that are overly dramatic, that can be a problem. Where they're getting really upset, or they're yelling at each other, or they're just, too big of an emotional reaction to smaller things. You want the thing that happens to be impactful, but you don't want your characters to freak out about it all the time, because at the end, you're going to put them through worse. So if they're freaking out all the time, it's not going to make sense at the end when they, freak out again. So that's kind of the main things that I wanted to focus on. And at the end, there was one bonus thing about using italics to show thoughts. The other thing that I've seen done poorly in a debut first chapter is like half seen and half thinking. So like every sentence of things happening or scene description, there's a sentence in italics of the character's thoughtful reactions to the thing. That can really slow up the action. It's okay to have thoughts from your characters in italic text every once in a while. I would really try to avoid them as much as possible. Every time you do it, you're slowing down the action. It can be useful to present some information and tension, but you want to be careful about using it as a form of narration where your character is commenting on everything that happens, so that you basically have the same things happening twice. Anyway, it's annoying. It can really slow down your thing. I understand why people do it. These are all things that are completely normal and natural. These are things that almost every first-time novel has in common. So these aren't like, this isn't bad writing. This is just when you try to write a novel for the first time, these are the easiest ways to present information that you're probably going to do, that no one's told you is wrong. And if you're trying to improve your craft, you want to figure out as many hacks or cheat sheets that you can. These aren't necessarily universal rules, but they may help you to avoid the problem areas faster and get to your real story. The first couple chapters are crucial, because if people don't read the first couple chapters, the rest of your book, it doesn't matter at all what happens. You've already lost them in the beginning. So that's why these are so important. This is kind of a summary of the whole book. So if the book is too flowery or ornate, because I know I put a lot of stuff in there that I think is fun, but if you couldn't get into it, I hope that these tips are useful and they help you to improve your writing. I also have a free YouTube series on fiction basics, basically, that you can watch, and they go through basically all this important stuff in the book when I was first figuring it out. So like the brass tacks basics, point lists, checklists and stuff, without all the exposition. So if you're that kind of learner and you just want, the cliff notes, that's a free available resource for you as well. Thanks. Bye-bye.